directly occupying the center with d4 or e4 are white's most popular ways to open the game. But another important resource is to play the flexible knight f3, supporting the center and remaining flexible with the pawn structure. We're going to examine two interesting ways for white to continue after the classical response d5, claiming central space while inviting white to return to the classical queen-pawn openings by playing d4. If white would prefer to avoid mainline territory, the Reti and King's Indian attack are two openings that generally emphasize positional understanding when concrete memorization is typically less important. Both of these openings share a kingside fianchetto. The Reti typically involves striking against black's center with c4. In the King's Indian attack, after first playing d3, prepares to challenge black's center with e4. Instead of committing the central pawn structure, the King's Indian attack focuses on completing kingside development by fianchettoing the light-squared bishop, followed by castling kingside. We see this approach in action after the typical moves g3, knight f6, and bishop g2. Although white's play may be rather automatic in the early stages of the King's Indian attack, black has a wide variety of options. We'll initially look at black's approach of developing solidly and preparing rapid kingside development, starting with e6, supporting the center while preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop, although this approach does restrict black's light-squared bishop. White completes the initial plan by castling kingside. White has built a solid home for the castled king, remaining flexible with the central structure. In its most basic form, King's Indian attack players are usually prepared to play d3, knight b to d2, followed by preparing the central strike e4. Although white may have a clear plan, it's important not to play these moves automatically. If black tries to activate the dark-squared bishop with a move such as bishop c5, rather than mechanically continuing with d3, this is a good moment for white to play d4, grabbing central space while gaining an important tempo against black's misplaced bishop. A more cautious, as well as solid approach is to develop the bishop to the modest e7 square, preparing kingside castling. Since white hasn't committed the central structure, there are still options to transpose into other openings. c4 is in the style of the Reti, the other related opening we'll introduce later in the video. White may also decide to play d4, and if black decides to castle, this can transpose into the popular Catalan opening after c4. If white wants to play the King's Indian attack, then the battle lines will be drawn after d3. You may wonder why this is called the King's Indian attack. White hasn't developed a single piece or pawn beyond the third rank. Although the opening starts out in a slow-paced manner, its dynamic potential should not be underestimated. After black castles, white wants to strike in the center with e4, so this important pawn break is prepared with knight b to d2. Unlike moving the knight to c3, when it may be harassed by the d-pawn, the knight on d2 safely prepares e4. Although the dark-squared bishop is currently restricted, we'll see white has a specific plan to later activate this important piece. Since white is prepared to strike in the center and build an attack on the king side, black seeks play on the queen side starting with c5, claiming more central and queenside space before activating the other knight to c6, when white strikes in the center with e4. We can see black's dark-squared bishop appreciating the e7 square. If black decided to activate this bishop on d6 instead, then e5 would be a threat, forking the bishop and knight. Even though e5 is not currently threatening a fork, it is a desirable idea for white, trying to split the board in half. White gains a space advantage on the king side and will focus on attacking the enemy king. A typical King's Indian attack middle game struggle develops after knight c6 and rook e1. White's rook supports advancing the e4 pawn to e5. With this in mind, black sometimes plays queen c7, preparing to add pressure against white's pawn once it advances to e5. Moving the queen also allows black's kingside rook to join the queenside if necessary, for example moving it to c8 once the light-squared bishop enters the game. This maneuver clears the f8 square to help defend black's kingside with a future bishop f8, an interesting strategy worth investigating. Instead of focusing on development, black may continue to seize queenside space with b5, when white grabs space on the king side with e5, gaining a tempo against the knight, evicting an important defender of black's kingside. The knight can retreat to d7, adding a second attacker against the e5 pawn. The e5 pawn is an annoying element to deal with as it prevents black's pieces from using the d6 and f6 squares. Trying to challenge this pawn with f6 is a risky decision, as this allows e takes f6, suddenly creating a backward pawn on e6 as a target for white's pieces. After playing e5, gaining a space advantage on the king side, white begins the second phase of preparing to maneuver pieces toward that side of the board, starting with knight f1. This clears the path for the dark-squared bishop, but it isn't immediately obvious how white intends on activating the knight on f1. e3 is the obvious choice, adding pressure against black's center, and it sometimes is used with good effect, but it may surprise you that white could have another idea in mind. As both sides prepare their play on opposite sides of the board, we don't see a direct confrontation just yet. Black continues to grab space on the queen side with a5, and white claims space on the king side with h4. The h-pawn may continue to advance up the board, possibly softening black's dark squares if allowed with h5 and h6, confronting the g7 pawn. The h-pawn is also useful on the h4 square, as it supports a possible bishop g5, trying to exchange the dark-squared bishop, a key defender of black's king side. The h4 pawn also supports a possible knight g5, adding serious pressure against black's king side while opening up a path for queen h5, when black's king is certainly feeling the heat on the king side. A less obvious point behind h4 is opening up the h2 square for white's knight on the first rank, preparing to enter the kingside action with knight g4, eyeing the important f6 and h6 dark squares surrounding black's king. This strategy can prove quite dangerous for black's king, although with proper play, as well as calm nerves, black should have adequate resources to hold the balance. It feels like both sides are ignoring one another after the space-gaining b4. When white activates the dark-squared bishop while supporting the advanced e5 pawn with bishop f4. Bishop a6 is one option to explore, preparing to support a possible c4 pawn break. But it's also possible to follow in the footsteps of Grandmaster Wesley So by continuing to advance the queenside pawn storm with a4. We reach a critical moment in this typical King's Indian attack variation. White is focused on building a kingside initiative while black has responded in kind by preparing counterplay on the queenside. It seems as if both sides are simply ignoring one another, but now it's important to recognize the delayed clash of ideas. White is excited to build a kingside attack, but a player of Grandmaster Wesley So's caliber isn't going to simply allow such a one-sided advantage. a3 is a desirable idea for black, fixing white's structure and provoking dark-squared weaknesses on the queen side. So the former world champion Bobby Fischer demonstrated the important prophylactic measure, a3, stopping black's a-pawn in its tracks before continuing with his kingside attack. Preventing black's a-pawn from advancing allows white's c-pawn to remain flexible, so b3 would be well met by c3, keeping the queenside closed, limiting black's counterplay, which increases the effectiveness of white's kingside attacking plans. The middle game struggle is typically defined after b takes a3, b takes a3, opening up the b file, followed by bishop a6, activating the light-squared bishop while preparing counterplay down the b file with rook b8, eyeing the b2 square, as well as contemplating knight d4, adding pressure against the c2 pawn while challenging white's knight. As black prepares to generate counterplay on the queen side, white will likely advance the h-pawn up the board, trying to provoke weaknesses after h6, turning the h6 pawn into a hook that white will try to use to tear open black's kingside. Or if allowed, provoke dark-squared weaknesses after h6, attacking the g7 pawn. Knight e3 is also possible, adding pressure against the center and preparing a possible pawn thrust c4. But white may also follow the typical King's Indian attack recipe of knight 1 to h2, eyeing the g4 square, intensifying the pressure against black's kingside. The prophylactic a3 is an important line for the viewer to investigate, but Grandmaster So's opponent, the rising Polish star Grandmaster Jan Krzysztof Duda, ignored Wesley's idea and continued with the tempting, but less accurate knight 1 to h2. The knight eyes the g4 square, but black forces white to react to his idea after the strong shot a3, threatening the unprotected b2 pawn when white is forced to make a queenside concession. Capturing the pawn activates black's rook on the a file. It also weakens the c3 square, which a black knight would love to exploit. Grandmaster Duda decided to play b3, fixing the queenside structure, creating a serious hole on c3. This also invites a black knight to d4, as white can no longer challenge this knight with c3. White shouldn't be too eager to exchange knights on d4, allowing black to open up the c-file after c takes d4, an important source of queenside counterplay. In the game, Grandmaster So continued with the plan of bishop b7, clearing the path for rook c8, preparing to break open the queenside with c4. Wesley later played rook e8, and in this case allowing the knight on d7 to help support the kingside if needed with knight f8. This is one of the sharper lines of the King's Indian attack, but we can also see the positional subtlety required to play this line well. You wouldn't automatically assume securing the a3 square could be an important factor in increasing the strength of White's kingside attack, but it was precisely this point that allowed Black to gain a comfortable advantage, building dangerous counterplay on the queenside that allowed Grandmaster So to bring home the full point. That being said, if you're not a world-class grandmaster just yet, successfully defending against White's kingside pressure isn't always so easy in a practical game. So it's definitely worth your time to study model games to gain a sense of how these general ideas may play out in practice. e6 can lead to very concrete play in which White tries to build a dangerous kingside initiative, while Black seeks counterplay on the queenside. This does tend to lead to sharp play with plenty of interesting ideas for both sides to explore. One drawback to e6 is it does restrict the light-squared bishop. So let's introduce some other important ideas. Exploring a kingside fianchetto with g6 and bishop g7 is one solid option. Black may also decide to advance the c-pawn forward, either supporting the center with c6. A more ambitious approach is to fight for central and queenside space with c5. White can remain flexible by castling. When Black may pose a critical question with knight c6. Black is suggesting the option of building a broad center with e5, resembling a d4 opening with colors reversed. White may decide to continue with d4, turning the game into a Grunfeld defense with colors reversed, provoking sharp complications worth exploring. In addition to c4, White may decide to play in the style of the King's Indian attack with d3, allowing Black to either transpose into lines we just explored with e6, or grab more central space with e5. White's position is now a King's Indian defense reversed, meaning that White is playing a sharp mainline defense against d4 up a tempo. White may borrow a page out of the King's Indian defense playbook by immediately striking in the center with e4. The e-pawn is tactically supported as explained in another King's Indian defense introductory video. White may also decide to keep it simple by playing knight b to d2, preparing to meet bishop e7, with the central strike e4, adding pressure against Black's central d5 pawn, preparing to meet the space-gaining d4 with knight c4, adding pressure against Black's center. Black may also decide to maintain the tension by castling, when one idea is to play e takes d5, opening lines for the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, as well as the e-file to add pressure against Black's center. This leads to positions in which a familiarity of typical King's Indian defense themes will prove useful for both sides. Since White is not directly occupying the center with pawns, Black is able to grab more space with c5, often leading to mainline d4 openings with colors reversed, when the extra tempo for White can lead to unique positions definitely worth exploring. Instead of playing the space-gaining c5, Black may use the c-pawn to reinforce the center while restricting White's light-squared bishop with c6. If White wants to keep the game in King's Indian attack territory, then once again White may castle, when Black can activate the light-squared bishop before committing to e6. One option to explore is bishop f5, fighting for central control and delaying White's e4 pawn break. That being said, sooner or later White usually achieves d3 and e4, challenging the light-squared bishop. With this in mind, Black usually plays h6, preparing to tuck the bishop away on h7 when necessary. A more popular option is to play bishop g4, adding pressure against the knight on f3. Attacking the bishop with knight e5 is not considered too critical, as Black can play bishop f5 or bishop h5, preparing to later challenge the knight on e5 with knight b to d7. In this scenario, Black shouldn't face any serious problems out of the opening. Confronting Black's bishop with h3 is one critical option, allowing Black to surrender the bishop pair with bishop takes f3, followed by striking in the center with e5. White may also decide to play d3, when after knight b to d7, playing c6 suggests this natural square for the knight, possibly preparing e5. But it's also perfectly reasonable to prepare a light-squared central triangle with e6. Of course, White may continue with the familiar knight b to d2. preparing to meet e5 with the typical e4. If black decides to play e6, and white continues with the typical e4, black may calmly respond with bishop e7. Notice that e5 is not possible as black can simply capture the pawn, taking advantage of the pinned knight on f3. If white decides to unpin the knight with queen e1, unpinning the knight while preparing the annoying e5, this is well met by castling kingside. Black is ready to respond to e5 by placing the knight on the newly vacated e8 square. Although black's position may look a bit passive, this is a solid structure that has proven quite reliable for black. The knight on e8 may defend the king side if needed, but it's also prepared to enter the action on the queen side with knight c7 if this proves desirable. In this case, the light-squared bishop is outside of the pawn chain and is able to support black's king side if white tries to build an attack on that side of the board. Although knight b to d2 is certainly reasonable, Grandmaster Vladimir Kramnik, an excellent model to study as white, has demonstrated the potential for more subtle play in these kingside fianchetto openings by playing queen e1. This looks like a beginner's move, placing the queen on a strange-looking square while restricting the mobility of white's rook on f1. One point behind this instructive maneuver is to unpin the knight on f3 before it is even pinned. That may sound like a strange description, but the idea is that if black plays e6, white can play e4. With the queen on d1, the knight on f3 would be pinned. But now that the queen is on e1, white is ready to play e5 before black's king is able to escape the center. Although e6 is playable, his opponent, Grandmaster Nikita Vityagov, advanced the pawn directly into the center with the more ambitious e5. When white responded with e4, preparing e takes d5, revealing the queen's pressure against the e5 pawn. If black decides to activate the bishop while supporting the central pawn with bishop d6, white is able to open up the center with e takes d5. Black's best reply may be knight takes d5, when white can play in a similar fashion, but it's tempting to play the natural c takes d5. This appears to allow black to build a healthy two-pawn center, but white's queen on e1 allows the important tactical sequence, knight takes e5. Preparing to meet knight takes e5 with d4, taking advantage of the pinned knight on e5. White will regain the piece while saddling black with an isolated queen's pawn. The light-squared bishop is coming to life, so black's position will come under some pressure. In the game, black decided to keep the e-file closed after the pawn exchange d takes e4. D takes e4. Now that the e-file is closed, and thanks to white's queen no longer controlling the d-file, black decided to support the center with bishop d6. This may look like white's opening experiment with queen e1 has been a failure, but Kramnik justified his opening play by demonstrating instructive ways to improve the quality of his knights. He continued with knight b to d2, preparing to challenge black's bishop in the future with knight c4. After black castled, white inserted the useful move h3, forcing black's light-squared bishop to commit to a particular plan. White is ready to accept the bishop pair after bishop takes f3. Bishop e6 is well met by knight g5, continuing to harass the light-squared bishop. So Grandmaster Vityagov decided to maintain the tension with bishop h5. This sensible move does have the drawback of giving up the f5 square, an important positional point we'll see in a moment. Kramnik gained a tempo against black's dark-squared bishop with knight c4, preparing to meet bishop c7 with a4, grabbing space while also fighting for control over the b5 square. The e5 pawn is under serious pressure, so black added more protection with rook e8. Expanding on the queen side with b4, followed by bishop b2 is an interesting option to explore, but Grandmaster Kramnik decided to improve the position of his other knight with knight h4, eyeing the f5 square while revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of white's center. This enabled white to meet knight c5, adding pressure against white's center while preparing knight e6, eyeing the d4 and f4 squares, with knight f5. White is prepared to play bishop e3, followed by f3, restricting black's light-squared bishop, and when the bishop no longer controls d1, white is ready to play rook d1, challenging black's queen for control of the open d-file. To be fair, black's position is by no means a disaster, but this subtle positional pressure can be difficult to manage, especially when you're facing a positional maestro like Kramnik. As you can see, The king's Indian attack doesn't have to be a routine opening in which white repeats the same opening moves no matter how black responds, so there's plenty of room to develop one's positional understanding. The king's Indian attack focuses on rapidly developing the kingside, followed by striking in the center with d3 and e4. Just like the king's Indian attack, the Reti opening shares a kingside fianchetto. But instead of challenging black's center with the well-timed e4 shot, the Reti challenges black's center with c4, immediately confronting the d5 pawn, threatening to trade a flank or non-center pawn for black's central d5 pawn. The Reti is a hypermodern opening in which white tries to control the center from a distance, exerting piece pressure against black's classical center. Black has a wide variety of ways to respond to the Reti. Capturing the pawn is certainly possible, when not only is the simple queen a4 check possible, preparing to regain the pawn. Knight a3, as well as e3 are interesting ways to challenge the c4 pawn. If black wants to follow a more classical approach, occupying and maintaining pawns in the center, then we may consider two main approaches, supporting the central pawn with c6 or e6, or claiming more central space with d4. This position resembles the Benoni defense with colors reversed, a sharp, double-edged system against d4. Just like in the Benoni, white can chip away at black's center with e3, or first decide to develop the kingside with g3 and bishop g2. Since black is likely going to reinforce the center with c5 and or knight c6, a typical Reti response is b4. White claims more queenside space, fighting for control over c5, one of the key squares black uses to support the advanced d4 pawn. White is prepared to play bishop b2, adding a second attacker against the invading d4 pawn. One solid way to handle this is by playing g6, preparing to support the center with bishop g7. Another concrete option is to play f6. At first glance, the f6 pawn may look a bit ugly, and it's not without its positional drawbacks, but this is a challenging option not to take lightly. f6 prepares to meet white's most popular reply e3, or the natural-looking bishop b2, challenging the d4 pawn with the same reply, e5, supporting the center, building an impressive-looking dark square pawn chain, while also revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the unprotected b4 pawn. White may consider such responses as a3, supporting the b4 pawn, or c5, blocking the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the b4 pawn. White may also offer sharp gambit play with e3, leading to interesting and unique complications. f6 may look like a slightly exotic pawn move, but it's worth noting that if you're seeking an exciting, double-edged game with black, then you may be thrilled to examine the radical pawn thrust, g5. This shocking and somewhat underrated move is a more serious attempt than it may first appear. Grandmaster Mateus Bartel used this to draw Grandmaster Duda in an important national championship encounter, so it should not be underestimated. The game continued with a sensible bishop b2 and bishop g7, continuing to intensify the struggle over the controversial black d-pawn. This is a good starting point to start your analysis, but the main point to understand is that accepting the pawn immediately with knight takes g5 is a tempting but also suboptimal reply, as black has the strong response e5, strengthening the center while both discovering the queen's attack against the knight, as well as the bishop's attack against the b4 pawn, leading to a promising game for black. Advancing the pawn to d4 is a double-edged way to challenge the Reti. One solid approach is to simply defend the d5 pawn with either c6 or e6. If black decides to play c6, this invites a transposition to the Slav or semi-Slav defenses with d4. Since d takes c4 followed by b5 suddenly becomes a possibility, white may decide to support the c4 pawn with b3 or e3, leading to a slower-paced, positional struggle. Another typical Reti approach is to play the dynamic g3, simply preparing bishop g2 and kingside castling. This approach offers gambit play if black decides to accept the pawn with d takes c4, gaining a pawn for the time being while also opening the d-file for black's queen. In compensation, white's light-squared bishop can become quite dangerous down the long diagonal, and white may decide to later open up the queen side and cement the gambit with b3, leading to strategically complex play. Just like against the king's Indian attack, black can also play the solid e6, inviting a transposition into queen's gambit territory with d4. The typical Reti response is g3. when just like in the King's Indian attack, we may see the typical moves knight f6 and bishop g2, activating the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Once again, black has the option to play d4, a challenging idea to keep in mind. But black may prefer to keep it simple with the solid bishop e7. When after both sides castle, white's flexible play still allows some important options, including d4, turning the game into the Catalan opening. If white wants to play in Reti style, then we'll see the double fianchetto strategy with b3, supporting the c4 pawn while preparing bishop b2, exerting piece pressure against the center. Fighting for more central space with c5 is one popular option, and black may also decide to activate the light-squared bishop with b6, preparing to meet bishop b2 with bishop b7, helping support black's center and preparing to activate the light-squared bishop down the long diagonal if black decides to play d takes c4. We see a typical clash of styles. Black has classically occupied the center with the d5 pawn and enjoys a central space advantage. White's hypermodern approach applies indirect pressure from the flanks with a pawn on c4, as well as long-term piece pressure. This sort of play may lead to extended tension in which a majority of pieces remain on the board, or in some cases both players may agree to simplify into an interesting endgame struggle. A typical direction of play continues with e3, supporting the center as well as opening up the e2 square for white's queen, which then allows white to centralize a rook with rook d1, preparing to support the advance of the d-pawn. After black claims more space with c5, not only is queen e2 an interesting option, white may immediately increase the tension against black's center with knight c3. Knight b to d7 is one interesting option to explore. D takes c4 is also possible, opening both the d-file as well as the long light-squared diagonal. And black may also choose to activate the last minor piece with knight c6. The knight helps support the center, so black's position is well prepared to meet a non-committal move such as queen e2, with the space-gaining d4, gaining a tempo against the knight while taking over the initiative. With this in mind, white typically plays c takes d5, preparing to meet e takes d5 with d4, cementing black's d5 pawn in place, which will prove to be a target for white's pieces. A more popular option is to capture the pawn with the knight. Grandmaster Wesley So, playing white, continued with the instructive knight takes d5. His opponent, Grandmaster Lenier Dominguez, decided to keep the long light-squared diagonal free of pawns by playing queen takes d5. Capturing with the queen also opens up the d-file for black, preparing to add serious pressure against white's d-pawn with a move such as rook a to d8. The queen on d5 shouldn't sit too comfortably, as it's aligned with the enemy light-squared bishop. Only on move 12 does Grandmaster So commit his first pawn into the direct center with d4. It's important for black to avoid clarifying the tension in the center with c takes d4, as this allows the crushing knight takes d4, revealing the bishop's power on the long diagonal. When black is forced to lose material, you know it's a bad sign when black's best practical attempt is to sacrifice the queen for two minor pieces after queen takes g2 check, preparing to meet king takes g2 with knight takes d4 check, revealing the bishop's attack on the long diagonal. This is well met by closing the diagonal with f3, when black simply lacks sufficient compensation. If black tries to maintain the material balance with queen d7, this is short-lived after knight takes c6, capturing the knight while revealing the queen's attack against its counterpart on d7. After bishop takes c6, not only is queen g4 a strong option, threatening checkmate as well as taking over the center with rook f to d1, white may simply win the exchange with the forcing queen takes d7, bishop takes d7, and bishop takes a8. The hidden dynamic potential in the Reti should not be underestimated, and slowly building one's position from the flank should not be misunderstood as passive play. Rather than clarifying the tension, black may explore rook a to d8, preparing to meet knight e5, discovering the bishop's attack against the queen, with queen d6. In this case, black has a playable, although somewhat less comfortable game compared to white. Grandmaster Dominguez demonstrated a more solid path with queen f5, removing the unpleasant tension with white's bishop on the long diagonal. This also clears space on the d-file, so if white decides to play d takes c5, opening up the long dark square diagonal, black is ready to gain a tempo against the queen with rook f to d8 prior to regaining the pawn on c5. Grandmaster So decided to reveal the strength of the light-squared bishop with knight e5, increasing the tension against black's knight, as well as revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. This is a good practical option because if black tries to support the knight with a sensible-looking move such as rook a to c8, the queen on f5 is suddenly reminded that it isn't as flexible with an enemy knight on e5, so white can grab more space in the center with e4. Black is faced with an unpleasant prospect of queen f6, allowing the fork knight d7. Because if black tries to move the queen to g5, this allows white's kingside potential to come to life with f4. And if the queen tries to seek shelter on the h6 square, this is short-lived after knight g4, attacking the queen yet again. Queen h5 loses the queen after knight f6 check, revealing the queen's attack against h5. In moving the queen to g6, allows white's powerful kingside initiative to march forward with f5. Black's overwhelmed position is no match for white's dynamic kingside play. Knight e5 is a dangerous move, but Grandmaster Dominguez found black's only satisfactory response, knight takes e5, allowing white to gain the bishop pair after bishop takes b7. It appears black is in serious trouble as the knight on e5, as well as the rook on a8 are under pressure, but black is able to hold the balance with rook a to d8, pinning the d4 pawn to the queen. When after queen e2, unpinning the d-pawn, not only is c takes d4 possible, black decided to offer an exchange of queens with queen d3. When Grandmaster So allowed an exchange of queens on his terms with rook a to e1, activating the queenside rook after queen takes e2, rook takes e2. Grandmaster Dominguez secured the knight with knight d3, attacking white's dark-squared bishop. Bishop a3 is one interesting option, pinning the c5 pawn to the dark-squared bishop, but Grandmaster So preferred to keep the bishop on the long diagonal with bishop a1. He continued with the plan of c takes d4, preparing to meet bishop takes d4 with bishop f6, exchanging dark-squared bishops at the expense of slightly compromising black's structure after bishop takes f6. The Reti can be filled with piece tension, but massive exchanges can also occur, leading to this simplified, relatively balanced endgame, not an uncommon situation. This is not to say the position is easily drawn. In fact, Grandmaster So is able to grind his opponent down and went on to win the game. Instead of transposing into more classical options by playing d4 on the second move, the Reti with c4 or the King's Indian attack with g3 are both valid ways to steer the game toward less theoretical lines. In these openings, general positional understanding and experience may prove more important than remembering concrete variations. That being said, the King's Indian attack in particular can become quite sharp, so there's plenty of opportunity to highlight dynamic themes to complement the positional nature of these knight f3 openings. Whether you're looking for a way to consistently handle the white pieces, or find ways to challenge these systems as black, you have no shortage of interesting ideas to explore. Best of luck in your future adventures, right here on chess.com.